All right, welcome to Halitics. I'm Hal Ginsberg. So glad to be talking today. It is Wednesday, hump day, right there, right in the middle of the week. And I'm always a little bit excited about that. Always feels like we've accomplished something. We're halfway through. It's kind of cool. Now, I did tell you yesterday that I wasn't going to do a show today. And I wasn't lying. I firmly believed when I said it that I wasn't going to do a show today. The plan was that I would drive to Annapolis, the capital of Maryland, to testify on behalf of legislation that would authorize counties, and specifically the county where I live, Montgomery County, to use ranked choice voting techniques, methods, and specifically to approve equipment, right? To approve statewide equipment that would facilitate that process. That was the plan. There was, I understood, a press conference scheduled for noon, and I was going to go to that press conference. And I don't know if I was going to speak, probably not, but I would have been there in support of the bill. But the press conference was moved up to 9 a.m., couldn't make it for that. Still, I'm scheduled, though, to testify at noon. So I'm going to head out there right after the program, and we'll obviously have a hard stop at just one or perhaps a moment or two before, something like that. I did want to do a show, though. There's a lot of stories that really jumped out at me. I would love to talk to you as well. 240-242-5646, 240-242-5646. Also enjoyed the program yesterday with Arlen, but we would love to talk to you. And yeah, a bunch of stories that kind of jumped out at me, as I mentioned. I centered, I guess, I mean, there was another story we'll talk about a little bit that I was quite, it intrigued me. It's a topic that intrigues me, but in the end isn't as important, right? I mean, what we're seeing with Trump is an ongoing, consistent attack on democracy, on the rule of law, on politics where different positions, different viewpoints, people who argue different opinions are being punished if they take on the president. If the president views you, considers you to have been an enemy in the past, he is going to go after you with the full power of the U.S. government. And that is something I'm sure we've seen that in the past. I know there was Nixon had his enemies list. I never, and by the way, yes, there, please do click subscribe. I don't want to make Trump appear. I don't want to make the argument he's somehow sui generis. We haven't seen a president this bad, this like him, or he's doing things that we've never seen before. That's not true. We have certainly seen presidents do all manner of terrible things to try to maintain power, and also to, as I mentioned, Nixon had his enemies list and the like. But still, it does feel a little bit differently. And there you see his U.S. attorney for the District of Columbia, Jeanine Pirro. And I guess I should get my little countdown out there because, well, she's not. Yeah, I'll just do a different slide because the countdown's over. But they went after a bunch of Democrats who put together a video, bunch of, by the way, veterans, Democrats who had served in the military. And look, say whatever you want. I didn't serve in the U.S. military. I had no interest in doing that, but I have respect for people who do. It's a challenge. You really put yourself out there. You give up freedom. And I think there's certainly, that is, you're sacrificing, right? You're giving something up for your country. That to me is patriotism. Well, a bunch of Democratic office holders said to the U.S. military, people they have a connection to because they served. They said, hey, don't obey illegal orders. And there's reason to fear that, right? Trump makes threats. He's going to send the military in to cities if there's any kind of response, any kind of pushback against his policies, especially with regard to immigration law. But in general, there's real worry. It is not totally beyond the realm of possibility. So you know, the Democratic representatives and senators, including Alyssa Slotkin from Michigan, Mark Kelly from Arizona, and several others, put together a video, which we'll play for you in a moment, where they speak directly to U.S. Military personnel and say, hey, you don't have to follow an illegal order. In fact, you can't follow an illegal order. It's hard for me to imagine how anyone could view that as an illegal use of speech, right? That's not something that you're absolutely protected under the First Amendment to say. I mean, you're just stating the law. The law is that you're not authorized as a soldier to carry out an illegal order. If your superior officer tells you to shoot a bunch of villagers who pose no threat, and it's obvious that they pose no threat, and the officer says just shoot them down, no, you not only do you not have to obey that order, you may not obey that order. In the film Paths of Glory, there's a scene where the general is so angry, the French general is so angry that the troops refuse to attack a fortified German position up a hill in the teeth of machine gun fire, which would lead almost to certain death for every French soldier who braved that terrain, that the French general tells the artillery sergeant, I want you to start firing at the French troops, my troops. I'm French. I'm the French general. If those French soldiers won't face German guns, they'll face French ones. That's what the general says in the movie Paths of Glory. And the artillery sergeant says, well, I'm not, no. And then he says, you got to give me a written order. You got to give me, I'm not going to do that without, at a minimum, a written order, because what happens, it's obviously wrong. It's obviously illegal. I can't shoot at my own men, but you order me to do it and I do it. And then what happens if you decide, well, I never really said that, right? If when there's an inquiry and the court comes to me and says, how come you fired at your own men, at other French troops? Why did you do that? And I say, oh, the general told me to do that. And you, the general, say, no, I never did that. Then I'm going to get court-martialed. I'm going to get executed. So if you want me to do something illegal, at a minimum, you have to put it in writing. At a minimum. And in the end, the artillery sergeant does report that he was subject to an illegal order. And as a result, the general is demoted. So you do not, I mean, it's clearly, there's a law in World War I and the Great War. You don't have to, in fact, you may not, presumably, obey an illegal order. Now, maybe you do, and you say, well, my commanding officer told me to, and you probably wouldn't get in any trouble if you obeyed the order, but the commanding officer sure would be in trouble. But in any event, you don't have to. What did Trump accuse them of? Seditious behavior. So Jeanine Pirro, I guess, tried to trump up some charges against them, brought the Democratic lawmakers before a grand jury, and the grand jury, lo and behold, declined to indict. They said no, which is amazing because, as you can see, my thumbnail was no ham on that or in that sandwich, because, and the reason I use that is the old, you hear this on Law and Order all the time. A grand jury will indict a ham sandwich. And in this case, they did not. So my suspicion, what I'm taking out of this, is that there was no ham on that sandwich or in that sandwich. I guess it wouldn't be on, right? In a sandwich, there's no ham in that sandwich. It's a bad look. Prosecutors almost invariably can get that indictment. I did not, and I can, we have got the great prosecutor, retired Assistant U.S. Attorney Steve Snyder not joining us today. Thought about having him on, and we'll definitely get him back on again. I love having Steve on, but again, this was sort of a last-minute show I put together, and I didn't really feel like, putting somebody on the spot in that moment. But yeah, the bottom line is that there has to be something, right? I mean, grand juries will pretty much indict at the request of the prosecutor at the drop of a hat, but they got to have some meat. There's got to be something there they can chew on. And also, this administration has lost a tremendous amount of credibility. People recognize, everyday people, work-a-day Americans, many of whom voted for Donald Trump, are very suspicious of this administration's motives. They don't trust it. And when they're asked to lock people up, to agree to a prosecution, to file papers of indictment, they're looking very closely. This is a reflection of just how untrustworthy the Donald Trump Justice Department is. No ham in that sandwich, no question about it. And here's what Alyssa, I'm going to play the video for you. No, let's play the video first. I'll play the video. I was going to give you Alyssa Slotkin. Now, I want to be clear, and you know me. I'm not like some Democratic acolyte. Someone asked me, are you a registered Democrat, or you're not one? Because I've said I wasn't. And I try to be as honest and full disclosure as possible. So I submitted a re-registration request to become a Democrat again, become a Democrat again, because there's a Democratic primary coming up. The Green Party isn't having primaries. So I want to have my say in the Democratic primary and vote for anti-democratic establishment candidates. There are some. I want to vote for candidates who are against supporting the Zionist genocidal state. That's why I'm doing that. I want to vote for candidates who do support Medicare for all. And that is an option in the Maryland primary coming up later this year. So that's why I'm re-becoming a Democrat. But in general, no, my affinity is closer to the Green Party. But that said, yes, I do thank Alyssa Slotkin, she is an Israel supporter. She would call herself a Zionist for sure. She's not the worst. There's a lot worse than she is, I have to say, which kind of tells you how bad the Democrats are. Here she is talking about her, having been a service member, and why she is telling them, don't obey illegal orders.
I'm Senator Alyssa Slotkin.
Senator Mark Kelly.
Representative Chris Deluzio.
Congresswoman Maggie Goodlander.
Representative Chrissy Houlihan.
Congressman Jason Crow. I was a captain in the United States Navy.
Former CIA officer.
Former Navy.
Former paratrooper and Army Ranger.
Former intelligence officer.
Former Air Force.
We want to speak directly to members of the military
and the intelligence community
who take risks each day
to keep Americans safe.
We know you are under enormous stress and pressure right now.
Americans trust their military,
but that trust is at risk.
This administration is pitting our uniformed military
and intelligence community professionals
against American citizens.
Like us. You all swore an oath
to protect and defend this Constitution.
Right now, the threats to our Constitution aren't just coming from abroad,
but from right here at home.
Our laws are clear. You can refuse illegal orders.
You can refuse illegal orders.
You must refuse illegal orders.
No one has to carry out orders that violate the law
or our Constitution.
We know this is hard,
and that it's a difficult time to be a public servant.
But whether you're serving in the CIA,
the Army,
or Navy,
the Air Force,
your vigilance is critical.
And know that we have your back.
Because now, more than ever,
the American people need you.
We need you to stand up for our laws,
our Constitution,
and who we are as Americans. Don't give up
Don't give up.
Don't give up.
Don't give up the ship.
All right, I thought that was a really good video. I have to give them credit. I doff my cap. I hadn't watched before. This came out months and months ago. Obviously, Trump, chicken hawk Trump, right? Never served in the military. Kind of like Dick Cheney, torture Dick. I had better things to do in Vietnam. Trump never served in the military. And yet he is telling these service members, oh no, you can't advise service members of their right, in fact, of their duty not to behave illegally. It's quite extraordinary that Trump would go after them. And it's a perfect example of how truly unpatriotic Trump is. That type of hyper-partisan prosecution is what I would hope might cause some of Trump's supporters to turn against him, and some have, clearly, and they should. Here's what Alyssa Slotkin had to say about the decision by the grand jury not to indict. And this isn't final, right? It's not like there's double jeopardy that attaches to a request for an indictment by the U.S. attorney. A grand jury can refuse to indict, and the prosecutor can bring another, can charge again and again and again and again. They say, well, we got new evidence, or we this, or we're going to present it in a different way, but we're confident at some point the grand jury will agree with us. Now, they may stop. I think the prosecution against Letitia James and James Comey, I think they pretty much said, yeah, we're not going to be able to get indictments against them. It's so embarrassing. I remember I told you yesterday, we talked about some of the, was it yesterday? Maybe it was Monday. It was Monday. Some of the titles and the thumbnails that some video YouTubers use that are just so clearly clickbait, right? Panics. So-and-so's owned, humiliated. They use certain buzzwords that people get all excited about. Oh, wow, Trump was humiliated. I can't wait to see that. Oh my God, that's amazing. Oh, really? Were the Democrats, are they panicking now? Oh my God, I want to see their panic. I want to smell the fear, right? That's what the YouTuber tries to do. Caught with their pants down, that kind of, those kind of titles. The purple prose, the yellow journalism, the headlines. In this case, though, I think it is fair to say that Trump and his Justice Department really have been embarrassed. They have so much ability to shape what is presented to a grand jury. They did get, at one point, an indictment against Letitia James, and then it was dismissed, and then they tried again, and they couldn't get it. This is a really bad look for a Justice Department, for a prosecutor, that she can't get the jury to indict those lawmakers, and they're right. Jury's right to do so. And again, this is the bulwark against fascism. These are the they're not exactly institutions, but the various ways that in our society we have power centers that are independent of the administration, that are independent of political parties. That's a really important fact, because we know from what various Bush administration advisors, I think John Yoo was the author, was he? Or maybe it was Alito, right? Samuel Alito, the author of the unitary executive theory, right? That everyone who's in the executive branch of the government basically is speaking for is a little president. That it's one arm of one body. The president has complete control. This one individual is ultimately in charge of every aspect of the executive branch. And that's terrifying. It's just basically saying, hey, in other words, no, you have to obey what Alito's basically saying is you have to obey illegal orders. The president tells you to torture. You're not torturing, right? Bush, Cheney are torturing people in Abu Ghraib. And it's really Bush with Cheney, the Bush whisperer. But the torturer, the sergeant, the captain, whoever it is who's conducting the actual, day-to-day operations in that prison in Abu Ghraib or at Gitmo or wherever it is, according to the Alito theory, they're just basically the president. They're not an independent actor. They have to do whatever the president says. That's the Alito theory. And although I completely rejected the unitary executive, it of course has appeal. If you're the president, yeah, because I'm the president, you got to do exactly what I tell you. It's just like if I was there in that prison, waterboarding somebody. That's the unitary theory part. So if you buy that, you have far fewer checks, right? You don't have individual human beings who say, this is wrong, this is wrong. Well, grand jury is one of those checks. The grand jury actually is supposed to act independently. So often they don't. The rules are stacked in favor of prosecutors, but even so, they can and do stop dead in their tracks BS prosecutions, hyper-partisan, politically motivated, punish my enemies prosecutions like Trump's. So this is good. Here's what Alyssa Slotkin says. She's not going to cooperate with the Justice Department. She's not going to speak to them, as she is her right. But she also points out that how the indictments were rejected, the request for indictments were rejected. It was embarrassing, she acknowledges, for the administration, but it was also sad. It's a sad day because whether or not Jeanine Pirro succeeds is not the point. The point is that Trump continues to weaponize our justice system against his perceived enemies. It's what you see, she says, in a foreign country, not in the U.S. we know and love. Well, we've seen in the U.S. plenty of times. But she's right. It's a bad thing. It's wrong-headed what Trump did. And it's beyond wrong. It's an example why. It's more evidence, should any be needed, that he should not be president, that he's not deserving of the presidency, that this extraordinary privilege and power is in the completely wrong hands. All right, this story, this jumped out at me. I always find this stuff interesting. I know some folks, and I say, oh, you're kind of hinky or whatever, because these trans issues kind of appeal to you, or you find them interesting. I do think that there has to be some kind of compromise reached between the most activist members of the trans community and most Americans who are definitely of the mindset, let's live and let live. But just because you identify as a male, but you were conceived female, just because you identify as a man, but you were conceived female, that doesn't make you a man. It's part of it. Your identity is important. It's not everything. And I think that's right. I saw this story, and I really think this is a way where we can hopefully come to some kind of compromises. I was really interested in this. NBC forced to issue statement after misgendering Olympic athlete. So the skier, I guess it's in that picture, is named Ellis Lundholm. And Ellis was conceived female, is competing in the female category in a female moguls event in Cortina. But it's called the women's moguls event because there's men skiing and there's women skiing. And I think that's wherein lies the rub. I've often said language is a huge part of this problem. Ellis Lundholm's identity is a man. A boy, now a man. But Ellis Lundholm is biologically female. It doesn't make sense for me that a man is competing in a women's moguls event. But it makes perfect sense to me that a man would compete in a female moguls event. Bumps, right? I used to love the bumps. I loved to, that was my favorite part of skiing. I think part of my bump, all my knees and my bad back and everything else are in part because when I was a kid, I used to just go bang, 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 bang on those bumps. And that totally messed me up. Well, NBC during Ellis Lundholm's run referred to him several times as she. She's really hitting the bump. She, according to NBC now again, Ellis identifies as a male, and Ellis's pronouns are he, him, his. But NBC used the she, her, hers. And this, according to Outsports, this isn't Outsports, but NBC forced to issue statement after misgendering Olympic athlete. Well, it's hard for me to say they misgendered Ellis when Ellis is competing in the women's moguls event. And Ellis identifies as a man. So there's something totally paradoxical there, right? If Ellis is a man, which I accept, I'm not fighting that. Fine, you're a man. You identify as a man, you can call yourself a man. I don't have any problem with that. But if you're a man, then why are you competing in the women's moguls event? Which, by the way, Ellis Lundholm should be competing against females, against those who, like he, were conceived female. It's totally appropriate that Ellis Lundholm is competing against other females, not against other women, but against other females. So I think, and maybe I'm just totally naive, and I don't totally believe this, and I'll explain why I think at least some trans activists don't want to call it female moguls and male moguls. Why they want it to be called women's moguls and men's moguls. But if you're going to call it women's moguls, then you have to deal with the paradox that a man, a self-identified man, is competing in that event. Now, do you think Ellis, I would say the trans activist, do you think Ellis Lundholm shouldn't be competing in the women's moguls events because Ellis is a man? I mean, is that your view? Ellis wanted to compete in the female category, but not as a woman because Ellis isn't a woman. This is wholly appropriate. Ellis hasn't taken any, treatments, hormone treatments, testosterone, estrogen suppressing drugs. If he had, then I would say he shouldn't be able to compete against females because he would have an advantage. But he didn't. So yes, you're in the right category. I wish you luck. I hope you win. I don't really care. I don't care who wins. I don't follow it. Sports is so boring for me right now. But the problem arises because we're calling it women's moguls. We're calling it women's skiing. We're calling it women's soccer. But if we called it female soccer, female skiing, I think there'd be a lot less pushback because we all can agree that Ellis Lundholm, I hope we can agree that Ellis Lundholm is a female who identifies as a man. Wouldn't that solve the problem? Now, here's why it wouldn't, sadly, tragically, because there are some trans activists. I'm not saying Ellis Lundholm is one of them, and there are many who don't share this view. But there are some trans activists who think you should get to compete against the gender that you personally identify as. So they would argue that I suppose Ellis Lundholm should compete against men because Ellis Lundholm is a man, even though he was conceived female, is biologically female, has not transitioned physiologically. But of course, if Ellis Lundholm tried to compete against biological males against males, he would lose badly because he is a female. But the argument that people should get to compete against their gender wouldn't be based on what Ellis Lundholm, what works for Ellis Lundholm would be what works for trans women, for trans girls, because there are far, far more trans girls and women who want to compete against biological girls and against female. And that's the problem. That's why they want to call it women's moguls, because they want, some do, not all, but some who champion Leah Thomas and other males who are women, who identify as women and girls. Their argument is that those conceived males should be allowed to compete against girls and women. If you called it female swimming, then presumably Leah Thomas would not be able to compete. But I take the position that when it comes to sports, because of the obvious physiological differences between men and women, between males and females, I understand there are a few people with developmental sexual differences, and they're the hard cases, and I guess you have to look at those. And we should look at those. And we should try to make sure everyone gets to compete. It's right. But that doesn't mean we put females, we pit them against biological males who are trans. That to me is where I draw the line. It's just that simple. I draw it based on physiology, on conception, on chromosomes. And I think that's the right way to do it. And I final point on this, and I've said it before, but I think the left suffers when it pushes an agenda that most Americans, I think, understandably reject. How am I going to, what's the best way to put this? Yes, everyone should get a chance to compete. We don't allow that either. Only the best athletes, men and women, really get to compete consistently. And I don't think that's right either. Everyone should get that opportunity. It shouldn't be an issue. But if you go with the theory that after years of hormone treatment and after years of various chemical, I don't know what you want to call it, chemical medications, then a trans girl or a trans woman no longer has any genetic advantage because of they were conceived male. That may be true in some cases, I don't know. But if you go by that theory, then you have to support all manner of very intrusive testing, right? You've got to say, did you take your test? You got to do blood tests. You've got to do a myriad of examinations. Whereas if you just say, no, we're just going by your conception sex. Are you XY or are you XX? That's far less intrusive. That's far less problematic. So to me, this story really proves again that we should categorize sporting events at high level competition based on sex at conception. And if we did that, then Ellis Lundholm would absolutely be competing, as he is competing, against females in the Olympics. And again, I wish him the very best. All right, 240-242-5646, 240-242-5646. got into it on Facebook with one of my nemeses, I guess is the term. I don't really know. I'm not going to identify them. If they want to call in, I would love to talk to them. Let me see. Do we get any YouTube comments? I'm not even seeing my YouTube. I want to just check real quick. Sometimes I think that's an story, by the way, that does really get people, they get upset with me, I think, sometimes about the trans stuff. And I'm sorry about that. I understand it. You have a strong view and I take a position that's different and it upsets people. And I get it. I just would hope we can have the conversation without rancor, without resentment, without holding it against somebody because they see the world a little bit differently. That I think we all, as long as now, not everyone acts in good faith, right? I mean, sometimes people have agendas that are like a Stephen Miller, like a torturer Dick Cheney. These are people who want to do horrible, cruel things to their fellow Americans. I hope nobody perceives me in that camp. Maybe some do. But I'm always ready to discuss it. Is this awful? Is this going to hurt? How badly is it going to hurt? Does this make sense? Or is it important that we have a balancing test at this point? And those are the questions I kind of ask. All right, 240-242-5646. Not seeing the comments here. Sometimes we get them. Sometimes we don't. Yesterday had a bunch of them from Ken, /Ken, which was pretty cool. Love that. Okay, one of the questions I got on Halitics, YouTube Halitics, was, no, not YouTube, Facebook Halitics. This is YouTube Halitics. Facebook Halitics was, should the government be allowed to make you take a vaccine for public safety, or do you believe the patient has the right to make an informed decision? So the vaccine question is often very divisive and causes a lot of people to get really upset and excited. I couldn't believe it. Jimmy Dore actually, when he interviewed Cornel West, just raked Cornel West over the coals because West supported mandatory vaccines. And I don't know if he changed his mind or Jimmy's like, well, do you admit you were wrong? This was a terrible time. Now, I mean, mandatory vaccines, I see at the time I supported them. It looks like there may have been an over emphasis on forcing people to do it. Maybe it should have only been seniors or this or that. I don't really know. Sometimes public health decisions, you make with imperfect information, and you hope that the guardians of public safety are going to act responsibly and put the best interests of the people first. But that may not happen. And so the question was, should the government be allowed to make you take a vaccine for public safety? Or do you believe the patient has the right to make an informed decision? So I said yes, like trying to be funny, snarky, because I'm saying, yes, patients have a right to make an informed decision. But on the other hand, there are going to be times when vaccines should be mandatory. I mean, smallpox, we pretty much eradicated smallpox. If we didn't have mandatory smallpox vaccines, smallpox would still exist. Now, would you get it? Not if you'd had it. The vaccine, no, but it would still exist. It could still be a scourge against humans, against people. But because of the mandatory vaccine, we pretty much eradicated it, if not completely. That's a really good thing. And that is the benefit of having mandatory vaccines. A real benefit too, because what if, and I don't know that this could happen with smallpox. It appears it probably could not because it's related to cowpox and chickenpox, but it could mutate into some virus or bacteria that is resistant to the vaccine. So the thing you want to do with these deadly diseases, these ravages, is you want to destroy them, wipe them off, completely wipe the virus out. And that is done through mandatory vaccinations. I think polio, right? Same thing. This was a horrible scourge. And mandatory vaccines have pretty much rendered it gone. There's the theory of herd immunity, that some people aren't necessarily going to be protected. The vaccine doesn't protect everybody equally well. Some people it protects very well. You take the vaccine, you're not going to get sick. I think measles is an example of that particular disease, where for some people, most people, they get the measles vaccine, they're not going to get measles. But some people, even if they take the measles vaccine, might get the measles if they're exposed to it. So you may make it mandatory so that those who are at risk are very, very unlikely to contact somebody who has measles. If only 1 in 100 can contract measles after the measles vaccine and everyone has it, then the odds are very, very unlikely that an epidemic will strike. Even if, if it's 1 in 100 people two people who aren't protected despite having taken the vaccine are likely to come into contact. But the odds that one of them will also have measles is greatly reduced. And even if one of them does and they transmit it to the other, then that person is very unlikely to, run into another individual who is susceptible. So again, mandatory vaccines can be a huge boon to public health. So I said yes, right? Should the government be allowed to make you take a vaccine, or do you believe the patient has a right? I believe in informed decisions too. So then the person who posted this didn't like my snarky answer. Which one is it? Do you think mandatory vaccination should be implemented by the government for your safety? Of course, in a somewhat sarcastic or ironic way. So, that's not such an easy question to answer. And I see the nuance, right? Now, and I want to say, this is another, I was talking about the trans issue, that has cost, I think it has cost me friends. And I don't think it's necessarily my take has cost me friends, but, that I'm somewhat insistent on it when I'm saying, look, as progressives, if we want people to take us seriously, we have to be willing to see both sides of certain issues. And the issue of mandatory vaccines does have another side to it. Even though on balance, I certainly get the argument in support of it. And scientifically, it makes sense in many cases. I think you have to be willing to see both sides. But if you take that position, some people who are adamant, and I distinctly remember 6 years ago, 7 years ago, 8 years ago, really getting into it on social media with people that I had considered to be close friends who I knew personally, and I had to block them. Now, I'm not saying I handled it perfectly. I'm sure I didn't. But they really didn't like the position that I took then, that I take exactly right now. Given that we have an obscene for-profit healthcare system, there is very legitimate suspicion of the motives of the pharmaceutical companies, which exercise undue influence over elected officials. So because of that for-profit motive, I understand why people would say, well, I don't know. Do we really need these? Do we really need these vaccines, or are we being forced to take and are we paying Pfizer and Merck and whoever else, Moderna, out of taxpayer money? I understand I have to reach in my pocket, but it is my taxpayer money is going to these companies. Do we really, really, really need to pay them? Do we really need these vaccines, or are we being coerced into or being pushed or cajoled into them because it's to the benefit of these for-profit companies? And what's I think a point in favor of that argument, the argument that we should be suspicious of the motives of these companies, these pharmaceutical companies. What I think strongly supports that suspicion is that the disease itself that we're most focused on at this point with respect to vaccines, COVID, was almost certainly at this point the product of we don't know this. I shouldn't say almost certainly, was probably the result of a lab leak. It was probably the experiments being done in a reckless, careless fashion by pharmaceutical companies or by research that they were funding in research they were funding that led to the global pandemic. So they created this problem, and then they profit from coming up with a vaccine. That is certainly going to cause people to have legitimate skepticism of them and of their motives. So that's why I said, hey, I get it. I get why you don't trust these companies. Now when I made that point online, and I think it was actually before COVID that I had these online arguments. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was 2020. RFK Jr. was the big anti-vax stuff. That was later, but he had already started expressing his, and vaxxers were becoming a thing by 2016. And I was trying to understand their ideas and not totally dismiss them or cancel them or treat them like they're some kind of doofuses for their views. I understand where they come from. So I said, hey, yeah, we have this obscene system, and people are right to be skeptical of the government. Is the government acting in cahoots with pharmaceutical companies, either, on purpose, either, with consciously or subconsciously? Unclear. But in fact, most Americans want Medicare for all. The fact that we don't have it is proof positive of how these pharmaceutical companies exercise dominion over our system, how they prevent it from doing what's best for the American people and what the American people want. So we don't have Medicare for all, which proves that the pharmaceutical companies are too powerful. And therefore, forcing folks to get vaccines that will profit these pharmaceutical companies is a problem. But I continue to say if we had universal single-payer healthcare, I'd be much more comfortable trusting the people, the government, to decide the proper steps, right? Because the government is us. In a democracy, the government is us. We elect the people that we think will do the best job. And then the person I posted, and that was interesting, because what I posted would have totally infuriated my liberal friends, people that I know from college. They would be like, "How you're an anti-vaxxer?" That Jay would say, "You're an just by expressing some sympathy for skeptics, you're an anti-vaxxer." And this person, just because I said, well, if we had a good healthcare system, one that worked for the people, I would be much more comfortable trusting that the experts in that system to make the decision whether we need to have mandatory vaccines. Well, this person wants none of that. So that was a totally unsatisfying answer for both progressives and for the anti-vaxxers. You would trust the government to make your medical decisions for you as long as it was a socialist medical system. Got it. And that's actually kind of true. Yes, we are the government in a democracy. So yes, I do trust the people who generally, right, would defer to experts. I think most of us say, we're not doctors. Hey, we'll do what the doctors tell us as long as these doctors are qualified and as long as they're not getting paid under the table by, Pfizer, by Merck. So yes, I do trust the people who generally defer to the experts in the healthcare field, except when corporate corruption has taken hold like it has now. It's one big reason we need Medicare for all, and I continue. It seems like you trust a bunch of ignorant, demagogic podcasters, people like Jimmy Dore who really don't understand. I know he'd say, oh, I understand it, fine. And he's made some points, but his single-minded insistence that this was one of the great crimes of the 21st century is just not the lab leak. That was a terrible thing. But just saying we've got to have vaccines. No, this was, I believe, and I have no reason to think otherwise, for people acting mostly in good faith. But there's always that fear. Maybe there was a profit motive was creeping in. But it seems like you trust a bunch of ignorant, demagogic podcasters rather than the majority of your fellow Americans to make the right call in an emergency. And yeah, I do trust the American public more than I trust corporate behemoths. All right, 240-242-5646. I'll just finish this program. I wanted to get done a little bit early, but maybe I still will. I always have said I don't like spending too much time when we're talking about, what a bad president Trump is or what a good president, if the argument is Joe Biden is such a good president. I really have always had problems with looking at short-term economic numbers. The stock market has gone up under Trump. It went up under Trump in his first term, except for the last year when it was COVID year. There's so many factors that play into how an economy does that it's a double-edged sword when you say, oh, look, the employment numbers are down. Trump must be doing a crappy job because the next month they may be up. It's very hard to predict. It is true that in the long run, the economy tends to do better under Democrats, but it's not clear to me whether that's going to continue as we see a Democratic Party that's more and more aligned with corporate interests and less aligned with workers. Yes, if you have a New Deal, if you have a commitment to workers, to higher wages, if you have a commitment to smart trade that prioritizes the creation of good paying jobs in America, if you have a commitment to guaranteeing every American has enough, which would mean in a capitalist economy some buying power, then yes, that is best for the economy. But I don't know that we've necessarily seen that from Democrats in recent years. And if you look at the numbers that just came out for January, they're strong. They're not great. I'm going to go into them a little bit more, but on balance, the economy has started to do a little bit better under Trump, at least if these numbers can be trusted. Now, there's always that, right? Can you trust them? Because remember, didn't Trump fire some Department of Labor person because he didn't like the economic numbers that they published back in September? So are these numbers being fudged? Is there some hinky stuff going on? And maybe there is. And that's very scary. It's very frightening. But I would note, yes, the employment rate fell to 4.3%. There's some more numbers we'll get into briefly. Now, I don't want I don't want Republicans to win in November. I do want the Democrats to take the majority, at least in the House, if not both, the House and Senate. But these numbers don't really help that, right? Because if Americans feel like, well, the Republicans, I'm doing better now. I just got a job. Then they may be willing to overlook all the terrible things that Trump is doing that they don't like. Most Americans don't like thugs in the street, armed, masked goons. Most Americans don't like that. Most Americans don't like Trump's pro-Israel policy, but that policy is the same as what the Democrats had. And now, at least, I guess you can argue, I mean, I wouldn't because it's so bad in Gaza right now for Palestinians, but at least we're not bombing. We're not seeing bombs falling every day. It's more like every week on Palestinians. So the economy does loom large when people make decisions for whom to vote. And because Americans are skeptical of Democrats as they are of Republicans, it's generally a recency bias type decision. It's not like, oh, well, the Democrats over time, I know that my Congress member came to speak at our union meeting and promised to veto a bill, and he did, and it was a good thing, or promised to vote against a bill, and he did, and it was a good thing that they did, and so I trust the Democrats. People don't have that. There isn't that institutional faith in the Democratic Party anymore, nor should there be. So the parties really do depend very much on recency bias to get votes. Do people feel like things are better or worse? Remember Reagan's famous question, are things better now than they were then? You wouldn't deal with that as much if you saw the president as an FDR figure who was totally on your side and had been fighting for you and promoted the NRA. So maybe there's a blip and the economy drops a little bit, GDP per capita drops a little bit, but you'll still probably remain loyal to a party that you believe is loyal to you. That's not how people view the Democrats anymore. So this news isn't great for Democrats. U.S. hiring starts the year at a strong pace. The gains were powered once again by healthcare. Now that is an interesting point, and that's a point that I think I would make. I wouldn't spend a lot of time, but I will make it here. That's bad. Healthcare is very inefficient in a lot of ways. We're spending far too much money on healthcare, far too much per capita, because the for-profit healthcare companies are siphoning so much money out of the system, right? They're just clipping the coins. They're not actually adding value. They're just passing it around. They're passing around those healthcare premiums, taking a little bit each time, and actually using the wealth and power that they have to reduce your access to good quality healthcare. So the fact that the healthcare sector continues to grow is not, in my opinion, a positive. It's a negative. We're not seeing more manufacturing or just slight increase. But there's some other numbers that, regardless of where the jobs are coming from, are still good. The labor force participation rate, that's really big. How many people, what percentage are actually working? That's a real number. That's not like unemployment, because unemployment can be much higher than the report, 4.3%, but could be 6% if a lot of people have dropped out, and the real number could be much higher if a lot of people just said, I'm not even going to try to look. But at least the Department of Labor Statistics is saying here, labor force participation rate is as high as it's ever been. That sounds good to me. Not much in construction. Federal government shed jobs. So even with those cuts to the federal government, the private sector is definitely picking up the slack. That is interesting. I personally don't have a problem with government jobs, but the right would say, well, this is the private sector doing its magic. Okay. I mean, again, this doesn't provide a lot of fodder for Democrats to argue they would be better stewards of the economy. And again, it's important because we on the left, many of us, I think, were far too gleeful in trumpeting the rise in the stock market when Biden was president, or drops in the stock market when Trump was president. The numbers in general have not, certainly the recent ones don't suggest the economy is doing particularly poorly. And we are seeing actually real wage growth as well. Despite higher prices, wages have been going up. They've been going up by more than the CPI, at least again, according to this data. So if you're a Democrat, you better come up with some better arguments, I believe, than the economy. Or you've got to talk about the specific challenges, which I've always said Democrats have to do, working people face: healthcare, education, the lack of real social mobility. But Democrats have lost a lot of credibility when it comes to the American public. They got to figure out how to get that back. And that's going to do it for me. Just in under the hour. Have a great afternoon. Thank you so much for being part of Halitics. And let's see if we can get that. Remember, no ham in that sandwich. See the little emoji sandwich I gave you there with Ms. Pirro? Have a great afternoon.